Hey everybody, welcome to The Bottom Line. Tonight, part 2 on the Beatle recording secrets that were utilized during the Sgt. Pepper sessions. Tonight, a couple by Paul McCartney. Tonight we're actually going to be covering a few Beatles songs, but not totally each and every one. And I'll explain that as we get to each and every track that we're going to cover tonight. But after Strawberry Fields Forever was complete, they then turned to Paul McCartney's When I'm 64. Now, Paul had written this song when he was 15, and John encouraged him, just like he encouraged him to take out Michelle and rewrite that funny little French piece you used to do at parties. Now, When I'm 64 really adds a flavor to this album, and like every single other track on this album, is an essential piece to the whole presentation of Sgt. Pepper's Lonely Hearts Club Band. Now, Paul wanted this song to be coming from basically the lips of a 15-year-old or a teenager supposing what would happen over the years and asking the question, will you still need me? Will you still feed me when I'm 64? Now, when he wrote this song, it's evocative of all those classic 30s type of songs that were in classic Hollywood movies and English movies at that time. This showcases Paul's understanding of genres of music as well as his genius to write a completely new piece of music that should have been written perhaps in 1933. He was quite specific on the instruments he wanted in, especially the use of woodwinds. And here we see the genius once again of Geoff Emerick's close miking techniques. He mic'd the woodwinds so close that you can hear the wood in the sound. It gives the whole song an energy that could not have been achieved otherwise. Now, Geoff Emerick does note here that other instruments besides what Paul suggested were added later. Another snipe at George Martin. We all know that the Beatles' ideas were truly unique and valid, but often when they didn't have a clear idea, it was to George Martin that they referred to. I find it quite interesting that Geoff Emerick just adds that more instruments were added later. Indeed, a close listen tells us exactly what we all really know. George Martin was a genius. Now, as I mentioned before, Paul wanted this song to sound as if it was coming from the lips of a teenager, right? So he insisted that they speed up the entire track almost a full semitone. Now, speeding up Paul's voice and the entire recording wasn't a brand new idea in recording in 1967. We know that it went back at least to 1958 with Ross Bagdasarian creating Alvin and the Chipmunks, that being a very extreme use of speeding up recorded music. So he insisted that they speed up the entire track almost a full semitone. This would higher the register of his voice, achieving what he might have sounded like at 15 or 16 years old. All in all, an absolutely fabulous track, and so much genius given from all quarters of the recording team. Now, the next song up for recording would be another one of Paul McCartney's, and that is the fabulous Penny Lane. Now, it's interesting, with the start of Penny Lane, their entire approach on how to record music in the studio changed. During his break sessions, Paul McCartney had a portable phonograph that he would bring into Abbey Road Studios. And often he was listening to the Beach Boys, and specifically the Beach Boys album, Pet Sounds. Now, as we already discussed in the Revolver sessions, Paul had been very concerned about the bass sound of the Beatles. At this point, they had pretty much achieved a bigger bass sound and would continue to follow suit throughout the Sgt. Pepper sessions as well. But here we see McCartney had another pet peeve, and that was the very clean sound that Brian Wilson, as the producer and chief songwriter of the Beach Boys, was almost routinely achieving in the studios in America. So it was at this point that he brought in his song, Penny Lane. Just like John's song, Strawberry Fields Forever, this song was based on his childhood and some of his experiences on Penny Lane, the avenue itself. And just like John, his lyrics take on a poetry. As in Strawberry Fields Forever, you almost have to have an LSD-like experience to understand why people revere these two songs. And as I explained earlier, I have my own personal playlist of Sgt. Pepper, and I've always added these two songs to that playlist. And I think the saddest thing about not including these two songs is we don't get Paul's total psychedelic experience in a song that he has offered to us. Now back to the idea of achieving a more cleaner sound. Paul McCartney told Geoff Emerick at this point that he wanted this clean sound. Of course, Geoff Emerick immediately set into action. He suggested that they record each and every instrument on a separate track. Now, of course, with the limitations of 4-track, they had to be very careful how they approached this and still get the clean sound that Paul McCartney wanted. Now, this is the first time that Paul McCartney would be supplying the rhythm track. Now, by that, I mean often the rhythm track is the drums, maybe the bass mixed in as well, possibly a rhythm guitar. Ringo was known to be a human metronome, but it's interesting here. Paul did not employ him to tap out a beat for him in the studio, instead opting to keep the beat in his own head as he layered keyboard after keyboard after keyboard part, laboring on each overdub to achieve the sound he had in his head. With Geoff Emerick in the studio keeping tape hiss at a minimum, bouncing carefully, and even admitting that there were so many piano overdubs for this song that some of the keyboard parts just got buried so far in the mix that they are virtually unhearable in any of the recordings of the song. But with each layering, the keyboard sound took on a totally different sound nature, when finally achieving the sound that Paul heard in his head and very careful overdubbing, they would then proceed further with the song. Now at this point, Paul wanted some orchestration. He came up with some specific ideas and even instruments. At this point, he wanted to add flutes, trumpets, piccolos, and flugelhorn. Now it's interesting, at this point, Geoff Emerick brings up that later more instruments were added. He doesn't give specific credit to George Martin once again, because with the addition of George Martin's additional instruments, we hear a wonderful song. And of course, George was the expert at the voicings of these particular instruments. Now you would think at this point the song would be done, but no. In between recordings one night, Paul McCartney heard a concert on television. He had watched Bach's Brandenburg Concerto No. 2 the previous night, and he had heard an instrument that he had never quite picked up on before. So first thing in the studio, he asked, of course, George Martin, "What was that high sound I heard?" George Martin informed him it was the sound of a piccolo trumpet. Immediately, Paul knew what he needed to finish Penny Lane. Bringing in Dave Mason, one of the finest trumpet players in the world, with him sitting patiently as Paul tried to explain the notes he wanted to George Martin, and George Martin translating Paul's ideas onto paper, Dave Mason then proceeded to accomplish in one take that not even Paul McCartney could believe he could do. This is that high trumpet sound that pierces through the song, both in the middle of the song as well as later editions of this song, providing an ending with the same piccolo trumpet. Paul at this point had the audacity to ask Dave to please re-record it again. This is when George Martin says, "Are you out of your mind, man? Nobody could possibly play that better." Dave Mason even saying, "I'm sorry, I've played it the very best I can. Re-recording it won't change a thing. That's as good as I can do it." Now the book brings out that there was a flash of anger in Paul's eyes directed toward George Martin. But as usual, it didn't last long, and Paul replied, "Right, David, you're released on your own recognizance." And with that little bit of drama out of the way, another Beatle masterpiece was achieved. Now, the next song up to be recorded was another John Lennon masterpiece, and this was A Day in the Life. Now, I'm only going to cover the first recording session of A Day in the Life because the Beatles would continue to record several other songs while they would shelve temporarily A Day in the Life by John Lennon. So we're going to cover A Day in the Life in a future video, but this first recording session was really just no more than a demo of John bringing in a song he had recorded. They recorded him on his acoustic guitar and his voice. With just that simple demo, the whole recording team were numb. Beatle historians who have had access to these tapes agree. This simple rendition of John Lennon with a very haunted voice was enough to show everyone concerned that something great was truly on the horizon. At this point, they even went with one further recording, but that gets into the more heavier production of the song, and we'll cover that, as I said, in a later video. Right after the first couple of recordings of A Day in the Life that was up to be recorded was Paul McCartney's Sgt. Pepper's Lonely Hearts Club Band. Now, in a recent interview, Paul McCartney actually said he got the idea by mishearing Mal Evans on a plane trip back to England from America. His memory is that Mal Evans asked him for some salt and pepper. But because Paul was tired, perhaps because of airplane noise, he heard it as Sgt. Pepper. During that plane ride, he would even start drawing up ideas in his notes that would germinate the entire idea of Sgt. Pepper being a concept sort of album. Later, he would polish those ideas that the Beatles would just make an album pretending to be Sgt. Pepper's Lonely Hearts Club Band rather than the Beatles. He felt, and John agreed, that this would free them up in their creativity for the entire project. Now, Paul once again had a different idea of how he wanted to approach recording the rhythm track. This time, he wanted to play rhythm guitar, asking John to play bass. Now, Geoff Emerick knew that John did not have the feel for the bass guitar that McCartney had, so he chose to direct inject John's bass into a single track. At the time, this was done with a DI box, which stood for direct injection. Often, you would take a guitar cord, plug it into the instrument, into the box, another cord from the box into the console, and then no studio leakage. Later, you could take that same track and re-record over it the bass part you wanted. And indeed, in the end, that's exactly what McCartney would do. Now, it's noted that George Harrison here spent a lot of time trying to develop a lead solo for the song, but McCartney had some specific ideas and was generally a very good guitarist on his own anyway. So McCartney himself recorded the lead guitar part for the song. Now, Emerick in his book says Harrison wasn't very happy with this. I can't imagine that he was, but he was also mad enough to back down knowing McCartney had accomplished quite a solo, just as McCartney had accomplished quite a solo on one of his previous tracks, Taxman. Now, most of the recording was accomplished at this point, but there were still additional add-ons that would be added later. Edits that would tie this song into with a little help from my friends, as well as sound effects of audience applauding and falling into laughter. But the basic tracks were done, and we'll be talking about some of the post-editing on some of these songs we can't completely cover in one video in our final video on the series. It's at this point the Beatles return their attention to A Day in the Life, and A Day in the Life will be covered in our very next video. Want to thank everybody for watching. For those who are sharing our videos, again, a big thank you. And if you find any value in our videos, please consider to subscribe to the tribe by hitting the subscribe button and then that top bell notification, and you'll be notified of all future videos in the future. This is The Bottom Line. I'm Ron Nasty, and I've come to the conclusion that I must be in Louvre. Once again, it doesn't sound a bit like Cagney to me.